Since I tabled our province's budget in February, our province, the world, and our lives have changed in ways that will shape generations. In February, I tabled a balanced budget with zero operating debt and ample prudence. We were preparing for an economic moderation. We were well equipped to be able to weather the challenges. What came next was unprecedented. Mere weeks after the budget 2020 was tabled, our entire world changed. From the beginning here in British Columbia, we followed the advice of Dr. Bonnie Henry and Minister Adrian Dix. British Columbians made tremendous sacrifices to protect our loved ones and our communities by preventing the spread of COVID-19. Words like self-isolation, physical distancing, and flattening the curve became part of our daily conversations. People stayed home, businesses closed, and transitioned their operations, and again, physical distancing became an integral part of our day-to-day lives. Every day at 7 p.m., people took to their windows, to their yards, to their doors, to thank the frontline workers who kept our province going through the height of the crisis. People looked after one another, and our mantra became be kind, be calm, and be safe. Each and every day we've learned to navigate the health and economic crisis together. The impacts have been great. BC has lost over 235,000 jobs since February. Youth unemployment is at a staggering 29%, and women continue to be much more likely to have lost their jobs than a man. As I've said often, these aren't simply numbers. These are people. These are families. These are businesses and our communities. BC was fortunate to come into COVID-19 from a place of economic strength. We have a diverse, resilient economy, and we started 2020 with zero operating debt, AAA credit ratings, and one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. Because of that strength, we were able to take immediate action to help people, to help businesses, to help communities with our $5 billion COVID action plan. I want to express my appreciation to all the MLAs in the legislature who came together very quickly to be able to give the kind of authority that was needed, the spending authority for the $5 billion. And I'm proud to say that BC's COVID action plan is one of the most comprehensive plans across this country to help people and to help businesses. We introduced a one-time tax-free $1,000 emergency benefit for workers. Over 600,000 people have received that support. We doubled the climate action tax credit, expanded it to provide support for over 80% of British Columbians. We introduced pandemic pay for approximately 250,000 frontline workers. We provided and then extended the $300 emergency support payment for those on income and disability assistance, including low-income seniors. We gave businesses a $700 million property tax cut. We protected people and businesses from evictions while deferring several taxes, giving people much-needed breathing room. And we're going to continue to provide the supports that people and businesses need as the pandemic and the economic downturn evolve. And as the fall approaches, there are in fact more benefits for families and students on the way, including the Child Opportunity Benefit, which provides families who have one child up to $1,600, two children up to $2,600, and those with three children up to $3,400 a year. More than 40,000 post-secondary students will receive immediate help with the cost of their education with the new BC Access Grant, which provides up to $4,000 for the students for their studies. Those benefits were budgeted well ahead of the crisis, and they're going to give families and young people a much-needed helping hand in the months and years ahead. In fact, the investments that we've made in our previous three budgets, including childcare, Clean BC, and housing, provide British Columbians with a strong foundation for recovery. And we'll continue to chart a path through these unprecedented times and of course always rely on the advice of Dr. Bonnie Henry and Minister Adrian Dix. So in a moment, I'm going to take you through what we think is BC's most likely economic scenario based on the information we have today. The projected numbers are staggering, but they're not without hope. Things are getting better each and every day when we follow the provincial health officer's advice. And today's fiscal update, though certainly far from Budget 2020 and the surplus that we tabled before the pandemic, provides us an opportunity to build a stronger BC that works for everyone in our province. So I'll move to our first slide. So I want to begin with just a very brief timeline of recent events. As you can see from the slide, the first COVID case in our province was less than 6 months ago, and so much has happened since then. We've seen the rate of transmission decline and we flatten the curve. But we also know that pandemics can come in waves. And so we're moving ahead with our restart plan with caution and very careful planning. Next slide. The public health measures taken in BC have limited the spread of the virus thanks to all British Columbians who've done their part to be able to keep the transmission of this disease down. To date, BC's number of confirmed cases per 1 million has been below the rest of Canada and most other countries. However, and you'll hear this reminder constantly, we must continue to follow Dr. Henry's advice, as an uptick is always possible. And we know that a strong public health response is, in fact, a strong economic recovery response. We flatten the curve because people came together, and it's going to take that same kind of discipline, that same kind of hard work, and that same kind of caring for each other to be able to help us through the economic recovery. Next slide. The economic impacts to date have been severe, and that's certainly demonstrated by the widespread job losses and the impact to businesses. So before I get into the specific economic scenario, I want to take a moment to go through some of the indicators that we've been tracking and use to be able to build the economic scenario. Just a reminder that there are lags in the data that we receive. For example, the retail sales data became available in June. That's for April. We got the employment data, of course, for June, just released on Friday. So that's part of the reason that you've seen that we took some time to be able to make sure that the data we were getting really related to the biggest difficulties that we were facing during COVID. So on this slide, you can see we'll begin with the labor stats. And as I mentioned, 235,100 fewer jobs in BC in June compared to February. And while the job losses in March and April were record-breaking, the figures for May and June, in fact, have seen some recovery of the losses that we experienced in the previous 2 months as the economy has started to reopen. The unemployment rate in British Columbia decreased to 13% in June, from 13.4% in May, as more people started to work again and as restrictions start to ease. However, we have to remember that the recent unemployment is at the highest rate we've seen in our province since 1987. Next slide. The job losses have also been widespread, not simply in one sector. There is no question that COVID-19 impacts British Columbians unequally. It discriminates based on age, based on gender, based on income level, and based on the sector that you work in. The employment declines since February have been concentrated in the wholesale and retail trade sector, accommodation and food services, as you can see from the slide, culture and recreation, and the construction sector. Hardest hit, youth and young adults. And this is in large part due to the fact that they're overrepresented, of course, in restaurant and retail services. Employment among persons aged 15 to 24 declined by 70,100 jobs from February to June. The unemployment rate for that age category rose sharply from 9.1% in February to 29.1% in June. That's an increase of 20 percentage points. Women are another group that are more affected by COVID-19. This is again because they tend to be overrepresented in the service sectors that have been hard hit by the pandemic. Employment among women in BC declined 120,000 jobs from February to June, and the female unemployment rate rose from 4.8% in February to 13.4% in June, an increase of 8.6 percentage points. And of course, it's important to remember that often women have to leave the workforce to provide care for children or people who are sick and sick relatives. Next slide. Let's take a look on this slide at the retail data, sales data. And again, a reminder that April is the most recent, so we still expect we'll see some real drops and some real challenges through the month of May as well before we started getting into the restart. No question, consumer spending pulled back during the month of April, and that, of course, was due to job losses, reduced mobility, physical restrictions that were in place. BC's nominal retail sales declined by 20.7% in April compared to March. That's the largest monthly decline on record. This followed a 3.7% monthly decline in March. So overall, BC's retail sales were 23.6% lower in April compared to February 2020. And where have we seen those shifts? Well, declines in retailers have been broad-based, but certainly in non-essential items, clothing accessories, hobbies, books, music, and big-ticket items, furniture, home furnishings, motor vehicles. We have seen the sale of some items, food and beverages, has been significantly higher, but certainly the drops have been very significant. Next slide. Housing market activity, as you can see from this slide, is certainly mixed. We see home building continuing to be resilient. We've seen housing starts average 35,794 annualized units since February. But we've seen a huge decline, very steep decline, when it comes to home sales, down 45.4% in May compared to February. And while home sales rose 33.7% month over month in May, following a record-breaking decline, they still remain at 12-year lows. In June, we're starting to see some movement and we're starting to see some positive signals, but again, lots of volatility in the housing market. And the average home sale price in BC went down 4% in May compared to February, and that's the provincial average. Next slide. So this slide is interesting because I think it really points out the volatility that we're seeing in the nature of the pandemic on our economy. This slide looks at the private forecasters' numbers, and they've been changing their projections, understandably, given the kinds of information that we are gathering and others are gathering. COVID-19 impact is really being felt across the world, and consensus projections for global economies have been revised down significantly, as you can see on this slide on the right-hand side. June projections call for real GDP growth forecasts of negative 6.6% for Canada, negative 5.6% for US, growth up in China but only by 1.4%, negative 5.3% for Japan, and negative 8.4% for the Eurozone. And of course, BC, being a small open economy, is impacted by anything that happens globally. So related to this global activity that you're seeing and the drops in growth, BC's international merchandise exports have continued to decline this year. And that again is due to global pricing, global demand, commodity prices. Exports are down 1.6% in May compared to February, and down 14.7% year to date when comparing the January to May period of 2019. BC's exports to our three major trading partners, US, China, and Japan, are all down on a year-to-year basis. We're seeing year-to-date declines in all the key commodity markets you would imagine: softwood lumber, pulp and paper, metallic mineral, natural gas, and coal. So turning back now to the projections, significant impacts are expected all across the provinces, as you can see from the chart. Private sector forecasters expect BC's real GDP to decline by 5.4% in 2020, as shown on the left-hand side chart. The expected decline is 6.6% on average across Canada, and BC ranks fourth among the provinces. So the 6 private sector forecasters for BC range between negative 4.2% and negative 6.1% in 2020. And in fact, some organizations are forecasting even steeper economic declines. Central One Credit Union, for example, is suggesting negative 6.8%. The BC Business Council is suggesting negative 7.8%. So again, this really just highlights the kind of uncertainty in forecasting that we're seeing right now. Before we bring forward our Q1, of course, we will be surveying the 13-member Economic Forecast Council before we release Q1. Next slide. So I can't emphasize enough the challenges in preparing any kind of scenario right now. To present a possible outcome when you see the kind of volatility, it creates some real challenges. So that's why we've developed a scenario rather than a typical forecast, because of the unprecedented nature of COVID-19 and the uncertainty regarding the magnitude of the economic decline caused by the pandemic and the path of recovery, and what kind of path the recovery takes as well. So this chart that you're seeing speaks to the various elements of uncertainty that will influence the depth and the duration of the economic slowdown. And that includes everything from future outbreaks here in British Columbia, but obviously in other places as well, because that impacts us here as a province. The evolution of public health policies, medical technologies, vaccines, the response of the general public, impacts on consumer spending and confidence, the response of business when it comes to investment decisions, again, impact on confidence, supply chains, and business model adaptations. It's also going to depend on the success of relief measures and supports as those change over the next number of months as well. Corporate cash flow could shift, personal incomes could shift, and of course, policies of the central bank, liquidity in the system, and laying the foundation for recovery via low interest rates. Next slide. So the economic scenario was developed by analyzing employment by industry data and developing assumptions around the timing and the extent of business recovery and the eventual rehiring of employees. So this scenario underlying it is an assumption that the pace of hiring will continue to be cautious, that will continue our measured approach when it comes to recovery. It assumes as well that physical distancing remains in place, that global travel remains somewhat restricted, and that businesses in the tourism and retail and recreation sectors are expected to continue to be impacted for some time. The pace of economic recovery in this scenario is also guided by consumer and business behavior. So in this scenario, BC's economy could decline by 6.8% in 2020. As the economy recovers and hiring and spending improves, the economy could grow back by 3.1% by 2021. So just for a moment to put that in context, BC's real GDP fell by 2.4% in 2009 and 6.4% in 1982. Those are the only annual declines in BC real GDP and recent records going back to the 80s. So as those numbers really remind us, this could be the worst downturn experienced in our province in recent history. We built this scenario with prudence, as we do in each of our budgets, compared to the most recent average projection of the 6 private sector forecasters, which calls for a decline of 5.4% in 2020, followed by a rebound of 5.4% in 2021. We also know that many businesses are expected to experience a loss of revenue due to closures and restrictions introduced in BC and internationally. As such, BC's corporate profits are expected to decline in 2020 before recovering in 2021. And as I mentioned, physical distancing and global travel restrictions are expected to be in place for some time. Because of that, we expect the job losses that have occurred in British Columbia are not expected to be fully recovered this year. So the scenario is built with employment in the province declining by 9.8% in 2020, which corresponds to an annual loss of 252,000 jobs. And as businesses resume operations and employees are rehired, employment in British Columbia could increase by 4.4% in 2021, representing an annual gain of 102,000 jobs. Consumer spending, of course, has been impacted by job losses, lower income, and the temporary closure of some retail stores. As such, retail sales in British Columbia are estimated to decline in 2020 and pick up in 2021, again, when employment and income prospects improve. The housing market is expected to be impacted again by unemployment, by lower income, weaker migration. The value of residential sales may decline by 27.6% in 2020, followed by possible growth of 9.3% in 2021. And again, we built in prudence in our scenario for housing. Next slide. This slide is just a reminder of where we were at. As I mentioned, we have a strong fiscal foundation. Certainly before the crisis, as you know, surpluses across the 3 years of the fiscal plan, best debt metrics and credit rating compared to other provinces in Canada. And I put this here because I think it's important to recognize that that strong fiscal foundation will help us as we move into recovery. It gives us a good foundation to be able to build from. Next slide. So the economic scenario results in revenue losses totaling $6.3 billion in 2021 compared to the budget 2020 forecast. Taxation revenues down $4.2 billion. Natural resource revenues $300 million lower. Net revenue from Crown corporations and agencies down about $1.8 billion. So I'll walk through some of the specifics for you. A personal income tax revenue down almost $1 billion from lower personal income and wages and salaries. 2020 household income falls 3.9% compared to the budget assumption of a gain of 3.8%. Corporate income tax revenue down $973 million, again due to lower corporate profits nationally in 2020. Employers' health tax revenue, $238 million lower than budget because of employment losses and reduced payrolls. Refundable tax credits are $141 million lower, mainly from reduced film and production service activity. Provincial sales tax revenue down $1.3 billion. Reduced consumer and business purchases, of course, of taxable items. The lower housing market results in $465 million in reduced property and property transfer tax revenues. And residential sales declines 27.6% in 2020 compared to a 4.6% increase assumed in the budget. Fuel and carbon tax revenues down $353 million, reflecting reduced demand for gasoline, natural gas, and diesel. Natural resource revenues, $300 million drop, and as I mentioned, in almost every commodity price area. Commercial Crown Corporation net income, $882 million lower in budget. And almost all of this is due to the reduced casino activity, BC Lottery Corporation casino activity, and the impact, of course, will depend on any timing of reopening. The impact on the liquor distribution branch is relatively low, $37 million, because liquor sales haven't been impacted in liquor stores, but there's still a decline, of course, from restaurants and other establishments. This fiscal scenario doesn't include changes in the outlook for ICBC finances at this time compared to the budget. Because it's too early, you're seeing, of course, fewer accidents early in the year because of lower transportation activity, but that could be offset as the year goes on and as more transportation and more vehicles return to the road. There's also uncertainty, of course, around investment markets, so you'll see some additional pieces added in Q1. And the scenario also doesn't change anything on the BC Hydro results to date. Again, the corporation is working to address the impacts of COVID-19 and the relief measures that are in place, and that will be reported in their fiscal statements. Compared to budget, taxpayer-supported agency losses, $869 million. That's mainly lower international tuition fees and other revenue from post-secondary and K-12 schools. So now I'll go through some of the government's measures in the next slide. It's the next slide. As you know, COVID-19 is a global crisis that really needed a coordinated response from all levels of government. And in BC, we really focused our response. We wanted to complement federal measures and also meet the needs, specific needs, for British Columbians. So on March 23rd, the legislature approved supplementary estimates, which provided an additional $5 billion in spending for a COVID-19 action plan. And this includes the notional allocations of $3.5 billion for critical services and $1.5 billion to support economic recovery. In addition to these spending measures, we looked all across government at every financial lever that we had at our relief to be able to provide relief. And that included tax credits, that included reductions, that included payment deferral measures, and I'll talk a little bit more about those specifics in the next slides as well. So critical services, starting with critical services. $1 billion to support healthcare response measures, and these again are from the $5 billion. That includes everything from community and long-term care responses, lab testing, contact tracing, staffing costs, and preparing for the crisis. It also included additional mental health supports, such as our expanded virtual mental health supports, access to counseling services, and very targeted supports. Over $250 million went to ensure that childcare spaces remained available to essential service workers and to provide relief and preserve spaces for parents during any temporary closures. Nearly $90 million for housing and homeless supports, again to provide critical services and help meet the health and safety needs that were there. And this is in addition to the hotels that have been purchased to help people move from encampments. The province also provided additional funding to maintain services for vulnerable populations, including services to adults with diverse abilities and to support youth and children receiving provincial supports. Next slide. So now looking at financial supports. Again, I mentioned the $1 billion for the BC emergency benefit for workers. We also allocated $350 million to provide a $300 per month crisis supplement for those on income and disability assistance, and that also included a boost for the senior supplement for those low-income seniors through to the end of August. We provided relief to renters. We're providing a temporary rent supplement to support tenants whose income has been impacted by COVID-19. This benefit provides up to $300 for individuals and $500 for couples. We also partnered with the federal government on several relief measures. Pandemic pay, for example, will benefit over 250,000 frontline workers in health and social services with a one-time temporary wage boost. The Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program helps provide rent relief to businesses by providing forgivable loans to cover 50% of the rent payments for eligible tenants. And in addition to the broad-based financial supports for individuals and businesses, there's been approximately $40 million allocated for targeted emergency relief to support businesses and not-for-profit organizations. That includes everything from support to the agricultural sector and BC farmers to maintain safe food supplies, emergency animal care funding, and emergency funding for the hard-hit tourism sector, including support for parks operators to be able to safely reopen, and tourism organizations to support the recovery effort. Next slide. And then, of course, there's the $1.5 billion for economic recovery. As I mentioned, our health response, our COVID action plan, and our Safe Restart plan have really provided the foundation for economic recovery. We all know that businesses can only operate successfully if we work to flatten the curve. People can only spend funds at BC businesses if they have a stable income and feel confident that they can get out again. In addition to the foundation that we built, as I mentioned, we have $1.5 billion set aside. And we put a number of processes in place to be able to gather information from the sectors and from the public. The Premier has an economic recovery task force, which brings together leaders from business, labour, First Nations and not-for-profits to make sure that the province's economic response to COVID is effective and responds to the needs of British Columbians. The task force continues to meet on a regular basis. In June, as you know, we also launched a public consultation process to gather feedback from British Columbians. There's another week of that survey open, so hopefully people will make sure that they're providing their input. It's been really quite extraordinary and rewarding to see the number of people who've been taking part. And then in addition, for the last number of months, the Premier, myself, ministers and MLAs have been holding town halls, have been holding roundtables, sector-specific discussions, again to make sure that our recovery plan is flexible and responsive and meets the needs of people, businesses and community organizations. We look forward to sharing the recovery plan framework in September. Next slide. So I want to touch for a moment just on the relief measures that are outside the $5 billion. This includes, and again, as I mentioned, we looked at every tool we have across government available to us to provide that support. So this includes an increase to the Climate Action Tax Credit in July, that's $500 million. A reduction in the school tax rates for commercial properties by an average of 25%, $700 million. Delays in increasing the scheduled carbon tax and other budget 2020 measures, $200 million. And we also implemented tax and payment deferral measures. That included a 6-month pause on student loans, hydro bill relief and deferral measures, and a number of other tax and payment deferrals to provide cash flow to businesses and municipalities. Now, those tax and deferral measures don't have a direct impact on the budget in 2020 because, of course, they're expected to be paid back, but they did provide much needed cash flow and are providing much needed cash flow to businesses. There are some indirect costs, of course, related to deferrals. That includes increased interest on the deferred payments and any potential default that could happen. Those, again, as the payments are received, they will be built in and incorporated into quarterly forecasts, as well as any costs. Next slide. So just in summary, the BC Action Plan and the additional current measures total $6.2 billion for this fiscal year compared to Budget 2020. That includes, of course, the $5 billion in supplementary spending and the $1.3 billion that I just ran through for tax credits and other tax and relief payments. And then, while not directly impacting the fiscal plan, the government has implemented an additional $6.3 billion in deferral measures. Again, those dollars expected to come back. What about the current budget? You may have questions around what impacts have happened so far in the current budget. The ministry budgets remain as we presented them in February, including the existing contingency vote, vote 45. That's $600 million, just to remind you, that was built in as contingencies, we expect will be fully needed to be able to cover program caseload needs, other pandemic response needs that may come up, and other programs that may face pressure because of COVID. To date, as you know, there's been minimal wildfires. Right now, the estimated costs are at $50 million, which falls well within the budget that is put aside. Under the Emergency Program Act, we do expect that statutory spending will be above the voted allocation, and that's to, of course, manage any kind of emergency costs within the scope of the Act. So this includes $17.5 million for freshet related flooding costs that we're seeing, emergency management costs, which includes everything from emergency operation centers to coordination. The issue of travelers coming in would be included there. So again, we expect that there'll be additional resources needed in that area. And then statutory spending of $76 million above the base budget is anticipated to cover those costs. Next slide. So just touch a little bit on the capital investments and the debt impacts. We're projecting $22.9 billion in taxpayer-supported capital spending across the province in the next 3 years in our 3-year fiscal plan. And this, of course, was built in our February budget. And this is going to serve us very well because it really translates into huge investments in schools, in roads, in transit, in bridges, hospitals, housing, services that people count on, and services that we need to build a strong economy. So the capital projects are going to continue to proceed, and of course we'll be looking at whether there are projects that can move ahead that are ready. We do have some, as you can see from the slide, approved projects that are proceeding with procurement, everything from the Patello Bridge to St. Paul's Hospital, Broadway Subway Line, Burnaby Hospital, Highway 1, 4-laning, Stewart Hospital, Stewart Lake Hospital in Fort St. James, Caribou Memorial in Williams Lake, and of course the replacement of Mills Memorial in Terrace. There are other projects that are of course moving ahead with the business plan development, and those include the Richmond Hospital, the Cowichan Hospital, and a new Surrey Hospital in Cloverdale. So again, the fact that we had historic levels of capital built into our budget will do us very well as we look at the economic recovery ahead. Next slide. So that means increased borrowing. Of course, when we're taking a look at a deficit under the fiscal scenario, taxpayer-supported debt level, which excludes the commercial crown debt, is expected to increase to $61.9 billion at the end of 2021. The projection in Budget 2020 was $49.2 billion by the end of 2021. So flowing from the change to debt level, the taxpayer-supported debt to GDP increases to 22% in 2021. This increase from 15.5% that was forecast in 2020, again, is due to higher debt levels and also due to a lower GDP assumed under the scenario. We've been very fortunate. We've had in BC one of the best debt metrics and credit ratings compared to other provinces in Canada, which again puts us in a very good position to be able to deal with the recovery. Next slide. So again, although we're faced with increased borrowing and higher debt levels, we're also operating, as you know, in a time of very low interest rates. So from an operating perspective, we're very well positioned in British Columbia to be able to afford the annual interest costs. And as you can see here on this slide, whether you look at interest as a percentage of revenue or you look at it as a percentage of GDP, the levels are lower than they have been historically. Next slide. So again, just to emphasize, I think I can't emphasize this enough, this scenario is based on a snapshot in time. There are a number of risks that will impact our fiscal plan. Slower recovery, weaker global recovery, a negative shock that could occur, Crown corporations and their positions, a need for further government measures, wildfires and floods. I think it's important to note all of those could have an impact on the bottom line. And again, just to summarize, total changes since Budget 2020 amount to $12.7 billion. Government support for people and businesses stands at $6.262 billion, which of course includes the $5 billion in supplementary estimates, and then the additional pieces, as I talked about, the Climate Action Tax Credit and the other relief measures that we put in place. Overall revenue is expected to drop by $6.313 billion, and debt servicing costs $176 million. Budget 2020, of course, forecast an operating surplus of $227 million. So after all of those changes, you get an operating deficit estimated at $12.5 billion for 2021. Next slide. So here you can just see the outline of our economic response, the pieces that are in place already, public accounts still to come, first quarterly to come, the economic recovery framework launch, and then of course future budgets. So I think it's just important to outline where the fiscal picture, where we'll give you updates as we go along. So there is no question that COVID-19 has changed the way we live day to day. But it hasn't changed the priorities of our government. We're going to continue to invest in people, in the services that people rely on, and in a long-term strong economic position with jobs in every corner of our province. The pandemic has certainly exposed underlying gaps in our economy and our society. It's also highlighted areas of critical importance. Our recovery plan is going to be focused on our values we have as British Columbians. Taking action on climate change, addressing the rights of Indigenous people, building back government revenue, addressing inequality, and building a strong, resilient, innovative economy that leaves no one behind. These values are critical to people in British Columbia, and they're critical to us as a government. There's no question that there are big challenges ahead, but together we flatten the curve in British Columbia. And together, we're going to get through economic recovery. Thanks so much, and I look forward to your questions.